Count up a little bit. Give Cecil something to snip. And we will do our show. How are some teams abandoning the run affecting IDP fantasy football? That and more this week on the IDP Roundtable. Guru John Norton, we're seeing a trend now, not just a fluke, that is something we have to take into account as IDP players. And this, by the way, is a good moment to say playing IDP football, fantasy football, gets you more in touch with the evolution of the game. It gets you more in touch with these things because knowing them gives you an edge. And the Guru is going to tell us why.
Yeah, so when we all started playing this game, for me, a little over 20 years ago, your tight ends, if you didn't have Wesley Walls or Tony Gonzalez, you were lucky to get 3 or 4 catches and for 40 yards every week out of the tight end position. Then they changed the rule for the 5-yard contact. And then all of a sudden, we have an explosion of tight ends 10 years ago or whatever it was, maybe 12. And from that, it's kind of evolved. Now we're starting to see more and more passing. The rules are trending towards the offense. They're making it more and more difficult for defenders to cover receivers. You can't hit them hard anymore. If you hit them too hard, it's a penalty and all that good stuff. And it's adding to and creating a complete change in the complexion of the game as far as the way offenses are running, which is then leading to a change in evolution in the way IDP is evolving as well. We've already talked about the growing number of teams with no 3-down linebackers in the past. And linebacker position used to provide us with our consistency. They were the running backs of our defense. That's not so much the case anymore, or at least those stud linebackers are not as plentiful and consistent as they once were. Case in point, week 5, Devin White, Devin Bush, Kenneth Murray, Nick Kwiatkowski, Demario Davis, John Bostic, Joe Schobert, Corey Littleton, Levante David, Jayon Brown, all recorded 3 or fewer solo tackles. And why are we seeing this happen so often? It's because teams are going away from the running game. 10 years ago, it was the only time you had a team that didn't run the ball 20 times in a game was when they got way behind right off the bat and they were trying to play catch up and throwing the ball to catch up. This last week, we had San Francisco, Indianapolis, Tampa Bay, Jacksonville, Philadelphia, Washington, Chicago, Kansas City, and Seattle all rushed the ball, all handed the ball to the running back 16 or fewer times in their games. It's leading to inconsistency at the linebacker positions on week-to-week basis. On the other side of that, we saw 24 cornerbacks this week post at least 5 solo tackles. So we're seeing an uptick in tackle production at the corner position. And that's not necessarily a big problem other than the fact that they still remain as inconsistent as they ever were, and with only 4 of those 24 corners that had 5 tackles the previous week. So every week we're getting a different group of people that are putting up numbers, and it's making it really difficult as a projector that does projections every week for football guys. It makes some really head-scratching scenarios and makes it really tough to try to pinpoint numbers. And it makes you feel like the quality of what you're doing is not good, but in reality, it's the fact that everything is changing, and it's just that much more difficult to pinpoint who to play every week.
And I'll tell you, John, one way, just intuitively, that this has affected the way I play is IDP Flex was always a linebacker for as long as I can remember. And this year, I'm starting to put a safety in. I'm starting to put a defensive end in. I'm starting to put other positions in for exactly the reasons you talk about. The well is run dry, but Matt Schauf, Draft Sharks, SCHAUFDS, you know him, you love him. There is some help in the form of Foye Oluokun, who was a safety at Yale. So, there's a little position eligibility there as far as his game. But we saw him have those 18 snaps before he got hurt. Now he's back in the teens again, and maybe someone that can help us.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about him at least a couple of times on this show now. And I think the way, if you want to market yourself to the NFL, you come in as a safety, tell them you're a linebacker. That's how you stay on the field as a linebacker these days.
Yeah.
Working for Foye Oluokun in Atlanta. He's been healthy the past 2 weeks. He delivered 14 tackles against the Panthers this past week. We talked about that being a good matchup. It certainly bore out in that game. And Oluokun is now 6th among linebackers in fantasy points per game on the season, depending on your format. If it's more tackle leaning, he might be even higher. If it's balanced is where I have him 6th, and maybe if it's big play driven, then he's lower than that. But he's delivering tackles. He's doing what Devondre Campbell did last year. I moved Oluokun ahead of Deion Jones in my rest of the season rankings on DraftSharks.com this week. I've kind of been slowly moving Deion Jones down. I started out thinking, okay, now that we've got a full season between him and the knee injury, maybe we'll get some rebound. But it looks like Deion Jones is just not playing as well as he did a couple years ago. And I think Foye Oluokun looks like the better weekly bet for tackles at this point. It looks like that is what they want that position to do. It just looks like things are going to be funneled that way. So I think if you didn't buy him before now, you're going to have to pay more after that 14 tackle game. But I think Oluokun looks like a guy that we should be able to use the rest of the way.
And to the point about the safety linebacker tweener, again, it was almost a death knell for draft stock. And Telvin Smith, I think, was one of the first ones to turn this around when a linebacker was NFL safety sized. But now, because of those trends that John's pointing out, those players fit right in. Another linebacker that might save us, John, we saw Benardrick McKinney go down for the year, but this is one of those situations where his replacement might be someone that we can plug right into fantasy IDP lineups.
We back in the day that I was talking about earlier, if a guy weighed less, the linebacker weighed less than 235, 240 pounds, he was undersized for the position.
Right.
It was somebody kind of started. It might have been Mark Barron. It was one of the first guys that came in and wound up playing linebacker, one of those tweeners at 212 pounds. And now, the average size for those guys is in the low 220s for a lot of, especially your weak side guys. Tyrell Adams is going to be replacing Benardrick McKinney. McKinney was a solid player. He put up pretty good numbers for us. He's in a golden situation there with a lot of opportunity. Adams stepped right into that role. If they had changed jerseys, you would have never noticed that it was a different player. 7 tackles, 6 assists. McKinney's heading for IR with a shoulder injury, so it looks like Adams is going to be in there the rest of the way. He's going to have his weeks that he doesn't put up quite as good of numbers, just like McKinney did. But if you're in a situation where attrition is starting to take its toll on your team, like it is on several of mine, Adams is a good, solid add, probably be a decent third starter for you, if not better, the rest of the season.
Matt, not ads in dynasty leagues, because after the top linebackers, the next ones off the board were Willie Gay and Logan Wilson. And then not that long after that, Akeem Davis Gaither. They might be out there on your redraft waiver wires. Are they worth going after, keeping with the theme of help on the way at linebacker?
It definitely depends on how deep the league is. So, most IDP leagues, they're not on the radar yet. But if your league is deep enough, you're starting 9 or so defensive players, and you're looking for stashes who aren't doing it yet. Yeah, we mentioned them last week that maybe there was room for them to pick up, and it's already seems to be happening. In Kansas City, Willie Gay Jr. his playing time rose 2 weeks ago, 33% in that game. It was up to 47% in this past game. He had 6 tackles and a sack. So some good numbers for a guy who only played slightly less than half the game. It should keep climbing because Kansas City clearly hasn't answered its questions at linebacker over the past couple of years. Damian Wilson and Anthony Hitchens are not guys that should be playing every snap for them. I think that they've shown that they don't really want that to be the case. And even Damian Wilson, his playing time was up this past week, and it was way up over what it had been the previous few games. So I don't think that they want Damian Wilson or Anthony Hitchens in those big roles. I think they're hoping for Willie Gay to become a starter-level player. Not there yet, but worth stashing if you can. And in Cincinnati, we saw the rookies jump up in playing time this past week. Logan Wilson returned from week 4 concussion. He played a season-high 48% of the snaps against the Ravens. Again, that's not a level where we can likely start him in most cases, but worth stashing in case he keeps trending upward. Fellow rookie Akeem Davis Gaither, who you mentioned, led all Cincinnati linebackers at 79% in that game. So maybe Davis Gaither is ahead of Logan Wilson right now. Maybe he is the guy who's going to continue leading that group in snaps. Similar to Kansas City, they've got Josh Bynes and Jermaine Pratt there who don't look like answers. Josh Bynes is a journeyman who's fine as a fill-in, but I think Cincinnati was probably hoping to play Josh Bynes until the younger guys were ready. Keep talking about how smart he is so he can help teach the other guys. But I think they're better off if these rookies prove ready to play. We might be getting close to that moment right now. Jermaine Pratt was down to 57%. I think that they loved his athleticism coming in, but he's not looking like a player who deserves to stay on the field on defense. So I think we're going to keep seeing Akeem Davis Gaither and Logan Wilson work their ways in, and hopefully soon they're going to become usable IDP parts for us.
And the ball just keeps finding Logan Wilson, by the way. Another interception for him. And Davis Gaither has that light linebacker build to be a 3-down linebacker. Let's keep with this linebacker talk, John. And, of course, feel free to chime in on your Bengals linebackers there. But in San Francisco, Dre Greenlaw was so good last year that in the offseason, there was speculation that maybe he would be the weak side linebacker and the 3-down linebacker ahead of Quan Alexander. It didn't happen. Alexander was the 3-down linebacker coming in. But it looks like Greenlaw could be the 3-down linebacker again.
Absolutely. I touch back on the Cincinnati thing. Another note on Wilson, his snap count has increased every week since week 2. He has 2 interceptions in the last 2 games, and he should have had a third one this week if he'd have been able to catch it while he was laying on his back and it hit him in the face. But, the guy, he's a playmaker. He was a playmaker in college, and that's what the Bengals have most desperately needed at the linebacker position for at least the last 10 years, if not longer than that, is somebody that can not only be solid against the run, but can make some game-changing plays for him. So I am strongly believing that it may not happen this year, but by the beginning of next year, we'll be looking at Wilson and Gaither as the starters for the Bengals and hopefully playing full-time. Dre Greenlaw last year came on after Alexander was injured, had a great season, put up big numbers down the stretch. He had 57 solo tackles in the last 9 games, and a few other big plays to go in with that. Was a very solid addition for everybody late in the year. And like you mentioned, going into this season, there was a lot of speculation that he would wind up having that 3-down role and Alexander would be busted over to the strong side. Alexander came back strong, played well early on during training camp and so forth, and recaptured the full-time role on the weak side, and Greenlaw wound up sliding over to the other side. Now that Alexander's looks like he's out with a high ankle sprain, and we know that high ankle sprains tend to linger. It can be anywhere from 3 to 6 or 7 week injury. So Greenlaw is going to be back in the spotlight, at least for the foreseeable future. If he's out there on your waiver wire, this is a guy that's going to put up good tackle numbers for you, and he will probably contribute a big play for you along the way here and there as well.
John, who was the last big play linebacker for the Bengals? Odell Thurman?
Reggie Wilson.
Reggie Wilson? Yeah. It's been a while.
We
got to go back.
Wilson. We're talking like the 80s, late 70s probably. I don't know. Steve Tovar was a good tackler, but he didn't. Yeah, I guess Odell Thurman was probably the last one they had that made plays with any consistency anyway.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's fun to go back down memory lane, and I'm afraid, Matt, next year as a Steelers fan, all we'll have is memory lane with Mike Hilton because he's going to get paid, and he's helping you get paid with your IDP teams. Tell us about it.
Yeah, and a lot of times I think when a guy, especially a DB, starts the season with the kind of numbers he's put up, you think that the balloon's going to pop at some point. But Mike Hilton has actually, I didn't even realize how much of a pass rushing role he has played every season through his career so far. He saw 83 pass rushing reps back as a rookie in 2017, according to Pro Football Focus. Then 60-61 the next 2 seasons. This year, he's on pace to even break his own highs in pass rushing reps, and that's what's really driving his numbers. I mean, along with the tackles that he's gotten over the past 3 weeks, but the pass rushing primarily, 29 pass rush attempts through 4 games for Hilton, according to PFF. No other corner in the league has more than 13 of those. So he's more than doubling up the next most frequent pass rusher at his position. He's on pace for 116 of those this season. Again, his personal best so far was 83 back in 2017. And he's doing this as a 70% and 80% player, like a typical slot corner who's not always on the field, but playing a lot these days and certainly playing enough as he's showing us to deliver the numbers. Past 3 weeks, 8 solo tackles in each game. That kind of highlights what's good about playing slot corner as well. In addition to your team blitzing you a lot, if you're Mike Hilton, you're in the middle of everything, so you get more tackle opportunities. So Mike Hilton doesn't need to play more than the 70 to 80% of the snaps that he's playing so far to keep giving us numbers. He's already got 3 sacks. He's got 5 quarterback hits. He's got 3 passes defense. He had 4 sacks as a rookie, 1 and 1.5 the next 2 years. So he looks like he's on pace to shatter his own personal high. And he's already matched his totals in QB hits for each of the past 2 years. So don't treat Mike Hilton as though his bubble is about to burst. I say keep him in there. I underrated the start of his season. I underrated his pass rushing ability and role coming into this year. I think he's going to keep being a revelation for us this season.
Yeah, he's got an incredible sense of timing on the blitz, and another undrafted free agent success story, and one that I'll look forward to seeing him get his bag, but it won't have the Steelers logo on it. Let's go back to linebacker for a second, John, because Seattle, we can talk a little bit about how they used their linebackers against Minnesota. They were also on the field. I don't know how many plays Minnesota ran. It was a lot of plays, even though they didn't win the game. They played about as well as you can play without winning the game. But after Jordan Brooks got taken in the first round, you were holding on to Cody Barton going into the offseason thinking you may have a starting linebacker. KJ Bright had some issues. Of course, KJ Wright's been coming on. They take Jordan Brooks, and it seemed like maybe that would let the air out of the balloon in Cody Barton's stock. He came back with a bang in week 5. Seattle's on bye in week 6, so he's not going to be a high priority on the waiver wire. Should he be?
I'm going to say probably not. I think he's one of those guys that might be a one-hit wonder at this point. When they drafted Brooks, originally they were planning on playing him on the weak side and moving Wright over to the strong side. And then after they got him and started looking at him in camp, they decided not to go with that. May have been because it was a short camp. It's hard to say where they went there. But, with Brooks being hurt, Cody Barton gets an opportunity to play. The biggest thing I think that contributed to his strong outing this past weekend was all the injuries that they've had at the safety position. If you remember back to week 1, they were playing basically a big nickel type situation, getting an extra safety on the field. And then they had a couple of injuries there. They've been without Mike Adams. They've been without Blair. So they kind of reverted back to the defense that they have played in the past few years, with leaving all 3 of their linebackers on the field. This particular game, they had all 3 linebackers on the field together almost 75% of the time. But I think with Adams coming back likely after the bye week and the quality of play they've gotten out of Ryan Neal, who's absolutely balling for the last 2 weeks, we may see them revert back to what they wanted to go with originally, which is more of those 3 safety sets with 2 linebackers on the field. So I would say Barton is definitely a possibility. He will probably have a few games along the line where he puts up decent numbers for us, but I wouldn't get too overly excited about the big game that he had in week 5.
Matt, let's talk Giants defense. What's going on with the pass rushers? And also the safeties, this team's getting into the NFC East segment of their schedule, which can provide some opportunities for big plays.
Yeah, so Lorenzo Carter is, I guess, kind of the story. He went down with an Achilles tendon tear this past game, so he's going to miss the rest of the season. It clears up room for other guys to get snaps on the outside. Kyler Fackrell has been the one producing lately. I mean, his fantasy profile is going to be inflated now because he had the pick 6 against Dallas, which was a really nice play, especially getting it in the end zone at the end of that. But he was producing even before that. Over the past 4 games, he's got 6 tackles for loss. His playing time was trending upward even before that game against Dallas. He had sacks against the Bears and the Rams. They get Washington and Philly the next 2 weeks. So, I mean, as long as you don't have to overpay for Kyler Fackrell because of that pick 6, I think now's the time to pick him up and see what he does over the next couple of games. The Washington game in particular has lots of upside, and Philly has certainly shown that it has some sack upside. Marcus Golden also saw a big playing time boost in week 4. In week 5. Week 4, his playing time actually cratered at 12%. So he was trending in the wrong direction, but he rebounded to 86% in the game that Lorenzo Carter left. That's helped by O'Shane Ximines being on IR. So we're going to have to see how things sort out when Ximines comes back. I think he's still got 2 more games. I don't have that in front of me, but I think he got placed on it before the Dallas game. So he either has 1 or 2 more games left. So we should at least get Marcus Golden against Washington this week, maybe against Philly the week after that. Again, just like with Kyler Fackrell, great spots for sack upside. Marcus Golden posted 10 sacks last year, and he's probably not as good as the 10 sacks make him look, but he also ranked 14th among all edge defenders in total pressures. So he's not a total straw man. He got no attention on the open market, so he never gets paid for the sack production that he does put out there. But 4 total pressures against Dallas last week when his playing time rebounded. we know that Marcus Golden can put up numbers, whether he's doing it the way the coaches want him to or not. Marcus Golden's worth a look in pressure-friendly leagues. So keep an eye out for him and Kyler Fackrell if you play in leagues that, score for QB hits, score for QB pressures, stuff like that. At safety, they got Jabril Peppers back from his low ankle sprain this past week, but Peppers only played 35% of the snaps. He put in a limited practice Wednesday, so I don't think that it was a matter of him having to leave the game. I think they probably limited Peppers' playing time because of the ankle. I didn't read anything about him re-injuring it, and again, the limited practice today makes it sound like he's okay and that he's trending in the right direction. So we'll see if his playing time picks up. I don't think we can use Jabril Peppers until we see him get back to full playing time. But obviously that also clouds the picture for others in the defensive backfield for the Giants. The Giants also switched from Julian Love to Adrian Colbert. There was an injury with Julian Love the past game or two that made it look like maybe they needed him to get healthy. This past game, though, Julian Love was healthy. Adrian Colbert started the game, played, I believe, about 75% of the snaps in that one. So he's ahead of Julian Love. I would try not to use Adrian Colbert. I would try not to use anybody outside of Logan Ryan back there right now until we see how things sort out. But, again, there's some upside coming up, especially for them with that Philly matchup in 2 weeks.
Julian Love, another Dave Gettleman smash hit. Talk about pass rush help, pass rush production, John. Like you said, most of us are just trying to hold our IDP rosters and lineups together so we can get enough guys on the field with some reasonable chance of producing. But if you're looking ahead, there's a couple pass rushers to get before they're hot.
I think Marcus Golden's probably the best pass rusher they have there in New York, and I think he's been in the doghouse because he held out and tried to go someplace else, and they just weren't going to give him that much opportunity. That's just my opinion on that. A couple guys that I've been watching here that I like quite a bit especially if you're in situations where you have to try to beat somebody to the punch, as far as getting a guy on your roster ahead of time. I like where'd my notes go here? Oh no, Olivier Vernon. Numbers haven't yet surfaced, but he's a guy that is playing on a very talented defensive line, getting good pressure on the quarterback. He had 8 pressures in week 4. I haven't seen what the numbers were for his actual pressures this past week, but it seemed like every time I flipped channels and watched a couple plays of that game, he was chasing Phillip Rivers around somewhere. Definitely getting the playing time, up or over 80% of the playing time in the last 2 games since he's gotten healthy. He's a guy that has a history of putting up pretty decent numbers. And if you look ahead, the Browns play the Bengals, Texans, Eagles, and Jaguars among their next 6 opponents, and then they have the Giants and Jets in week 15 and 16. So there's pretty positive matchups along that line as well. Another guy that I am looking at is, where'd my note go again? Yes. Ifeadi Odenigbo from Minnesota. Guy's playing 70+% of the snaps ever since week 1. He was kind of a guy that we were high on going into the season, then with the injury to Danielle Hunter and so forth. And he really didn't do much early on, so he was released in a lot of leagues if he was ever picked up. He has 12 tackles in the last 4 games, had a sack this past week. He's been getting pressure on the quarterback. And the Vikings in general are getting better defensively. They're showing much more pass rush pressure, and I think they're just playing better as a whole. So we're starting to see a little bit more from him. It doesn't look like Hunter is going to be back anytime soon, getting second opinions on the neck injury and so forth, still on IR with really no sign to give us any reason to believe that he's close to coming back. So I think Odenigbo is going to end up being your starter in Minnesota and getting plenty of opportunity the rest of the way.
Can I just say I think it was appropriate that the Olivier Vernon notes you couldn't find them for a minute because he has a tendency to disappear.
Yeah.
Yes, he does. He's hard to find sometimes, especially on a stat sheet.
We like him for those nice matchups coming up, though. I agree.
Yeah, and this week, of course, Myles Garrett and Vernon against the Steelers. Last time Browns and Steelers played, something happened. I don't remember the details exactly, but I remember it was something pretty controversial. Let's just have a little moment of silence for Chandler Jones. It sucks, too, because it's Monday night. It was Dallas and Arizona coming up, and Chandler Jones has just been spectacular, spectacularly productive as an Arizona Cardinal, as a pass rusher out for the year. But we want to know at least who the replacement is to watch, if there's anything there. And I got to give a shout out to my man, Justice Mosqueda, who did his force players metric, where he was looking at basically an algorithm that you could find. And it kind of makes sense for pass rushers that it's a question of their mass and their explosiveness and their agility. And because it's such a short time that they have to be physically effective. And it was a very high hit rate. And there was a guy out of Utah, Kylie Fitz, who ran a 3-cone and a short shuttle at the combine in roughly the range of like running backs and slot receivers. And that certainly raised a few eyebrows. Will he raise any eyebrows as we look to the replacements for Chandler Jones, Matt?
Yeah, and I mean, this Dallas matchup is like a sneaky upside matchup now that they have the injuries at tackle and they have Andy Dalton in for Dak Prescott. So, I mean, this might be a spot where we look for sacks. So it really sucks to lose Chandler Jones for this one. But yeah, Kylie Fitz was the guy who stepped in and played the rest of the game for Chandler Jones last week. Came on for 49% playing time in that game. 2 hurries in that game, not much production against the Jets. You would have liked to see some kind of breakthrough thing here, but as you alluded to, an athletic winner. He's 6'4", 263, ran a 4.69 40, so a 78th percentile speed score. And speed score is something that I've looked into and found it to be a successful indicator of guys who might deliver as pass rushers in the NFL. It's a stat that matters for edge rushing prospects. So I'll be curious to watch Kylie Fitz. He didn't have a whole lot of college production. He had one really good season at Utah. I believe it was his sophomore year. It was like 7 sacks, 7 tackles for loss. But otherwise, dealt with some injuries, not a whole lot of production. So I don't think he's on the IDP radar yet, but, we'll be watching to see what happens. And if somebody named Fitz does have a sack in this game, you can say that you heard of him before it happened. Hassan Reddick is also in this picture. He didn't see any playing time boost against the Jets. So I don't know if he's going to play more than like the 55 to 60% that he's been playing lately, but he has at least settled into a regular role. And, maybe he's somebody else who could kind of flash for numbers here and there. So we'll be watching. Cliff Kingsbury said it's going to be a rotation to kind of fill the void here. Devon Kennard has been out the past 2 games with a calf injury. Kingsbury says he's hoping that Kennard's going to be back soon. So, we'll see when that happens. We'll see about his injury status for this week. It's a Monday night game, so we haven't gotten injury reports yet for this week. Dennis Gardeck is another guy that's in the mix. I don't know who Dennis Gardeck is. I got to be honest. As far as I know, he's a 1980s movie star. And then the one guy who's definitely not getting more snaps is Isaiah Simmons. He only played 13 snaps this past week. They talk about all the things he can do, all the positions he can play, but the Cardinals have lost multiple safeties and now multiple edge rushers to injury, and they still can't find ways to get Isaiah Simmons on the field.
The Cardinals take a versatile player early in the first round and can't figure out what to do with him. Well, speaking of matchups that can blow up for you, both in good ways and bad ways, John. Week 6, got 4 teams on bye, so pickings might be a little slimmer, but who are some matchups to tap and maybe a few to avoid?
All right. So I like the Baltimore pass rushers this week. And before anybody reminds me that 5 of their 7 sacks last week came from defensive backs, I'll remind you that the Eagles also allowed 5 sacks last week to the Steelers. So it's just going to be a matter of opportunity. The Ravens are going to figure out some way to get there. Matt talked a couple weeks ago, it might have been last week, about Matt Judon stepping up. That's kind of come to fruition. He didn't get a sack this past week, but I think he gets back in that column this week as well. Like Trey Flowers versus Jacksonville. Jaguars are allowing at least 3 sacks, have allowed at least 3 sacks in 4 of the last 5 games. Flowers is overdue since his big week 1 game. I think he gets back in the sack column this week. I like Montez Sweat and Chase Young against the Giants, who are allowing 2.7 sacks and just under a turnover per game to edge rushers, not counting any other position. Justin Houston this week and Danico Autry against the Bengals. They're in a neck-and-neck race with the Eagles for who's going to give up the most sacks this year. They've allowed 4.4 per game, including 11 to edge defenders and 3.5 to interior linemen. I mentioned that because Autry usually plays on the outside on early downs and then slides inside a lot of passing situations. Like Chris Barnes or Ty Summers this week versus the Buccaneers. This is one we're going to have to see who ends up being the starter there. Barnes left the last game with a shoulder injury. Summers had done very little before that. Got into the game, wound up with 6 tackles on relatively low snap count. but Barnes is expected to be the starter if he's healthy. So keep an eye on the injury report at the end of the week. The Bucs are running between the tackles regularly. And the last few weeks, we've seen Kazir White, 8.40. Kenneth Murray, 6 tackles, 4 assists. Danny Trevathan, 7 tackles and an assist. Roquan Smith, 6-1 pair of passes defended. So the Buccaneers have become a pretty solid matchup. Devin Bush and Vince Williams versus Cleveland. Bush is probably somebody that everybody starts pretty much every week anyway, but coming off of a 1-tackle performance, if you're hedging on that, keep in mind that Cleveland is the number 1 running game right now. Philadelphia only ran the ball 12 times in that game. They were one of those teams on that list that's not even trying to run the ball that much. And I think that had more to do with Bush's downfall. I like both of these guys this week. Williams, in particular, excels as a run defender, has a good opportunity to get some sacks as well, so he could contribute pretty strong this week. Jamie Collins versus Jacksonville. Collins is a player that earns his paycheck as a playmaker. He doesn't make a ton of tackles, but it seems like every game he comes up with an interception or a forced fumble or a sack or something to boost his numbers. Jacksonville is allowing 3.2 sacks per game and has allowed 2 turnovers per game on average so far. Malcolm Smith versus the Steelers. That's a great. Steelers have been a great matchup for linebackers in general. They do play a lot of 3 wide. And Smith is seeing a lot of times in sub packages. He's been averaging around 65 to 68% of the snaps. I think he gets up over 70% this week and has some pretty decent numbers for us. Taylor Rapp versus pretty much anyone that they happen to be playing going forward. Now that Jordan Fuller is on IR with a shoulder injury, Rapp gets back into that position, and we know what he's capable of there. I like Justin Simmons and maybe even Kareem Jackson this week against New England. This is a situation where it's a high ceiling, high floor. 9 safeties have at least 4 solo tackles, and 5 safeties have at least 6 solo tackles against New England in their 4 games. Carlton Davis versus Green Bay. Davis is an easy pick, kind of the low-hanging fruit coming off of the big game, but also noteworthy that 6 or more tackles have been put up by at least one corner in every game that the Packers have played so far this year. Davis is the leading tackler among the corners for Tampa Bay, so I like him in that situation. Chris Claybrooks is one of the 4 players that has put up at least 5 solo tackles at the corner position in each of the last 2 games. It's a rookie corner rule situation with a solid matchup against Detroit. Kenny Moore against the Bengals this week. Moore is the Colts' most productive corner, and the Bengals haven't let us down with this matchup yet. Some guys I want to get out of my lineup this week: Joe Schobert versus Detroit. Schobert's been somewhat of a disappointment already. Adrian Peterson, if they get him rolling, that might make a little bit of difference. But over the past 2 games, we've seen Devondre Campbell, Jordan Hicks, and Demario Davis all post 4 or fewer solo tackles against the Lions. Troy Hill against San Francisco. It's one of those slot corners that moves to the outside normally, but he's banged up, played with through an ankle injury this past week. Saw his snap count drop to about 70% after playing 100% most of the time in the first 4 games. I think the ankle injury was probably a bigger factor than anything, but between the injury and the poor matchup, he's a guy that I'm going to sit until I see him get a little bit more healthy. Joe Thomas is a guy that a lot of people picked up after Van Der Esch went down. He's got a poor matchup this week with Arizona, but more importantly, he lost about 30% of the snaps this week to Justin March as the Cowboys are trying to figure out some way of slowing other offenses down. They haven't found the right combination yet, but if they continue looking, I've said it right from the beginning, Thomas is not a guy that has been a 3-down linebacker in the past. He struggles against the run, and that's what's been getting the Cowboys killed here recently. Zadarius Smith has 5 sacks in 4 games so far, but a matchup with Tampa Bay might be where that buck stops. Brady gets rid of the ball really fast, doesn't allow a lot of sacks, and the Bucs are allowing less than a sack per game to edge rushers so far.
Where the buck stops, I see what you did there, John. It's going to be a great game. The Bay of Pigs, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. We got Kansas City, Buffalo as part of a Monday night doubleheader. Lots to look forward to. Always look forward to spending time with John Norton and Matt Schauf, SCHAUFDS, Draft Sharks. You know him, you love him. Check out all the work he's doing there. making my IDP teams better, making your IDP teams better. Of course, Football Guys IDP team has got you covered. Also, everybody, we love spending this time with you because you play IDP fantasy football. You know it all matters. It's all worth watching. We appreciate that you think we're worth watching here because you're so very classy.